Imagine the year is 1326, and you are Thomas, a simple peasant living in a small village. Your days consist of working the fields and praying that your Lord doesn't make you work harder. But one day soldiers from an invading army show up and tell you that if you lead them to the castle, they will spare your village. You don't want your home destroyed, so you take them there and watch as it burns to the ground. As a reward for your help, you are given some money and sent on your way. When you reach home, however, you find that you have no place to go because your house was burned down along with everything else. And in a twist, your Lord returns and, seeing you as a traitor for helping the enemy, sentences you to one of the most brutal punishments known to man. You are buried alive inside the castle walls. In today's video, we're going to explore this terrifying fate and others like it. Before we get into the specifics of immurement, we first need to talk about betrayal. This is not something that only happens in modern times or in movies. It was actually very common during the Middle Ages. Often, when someone would betray a lord, it wasn't intentional. Sometimes it was just easier to side with the enemy than to fight against them. And when these situations happened, the lords did their best to make sure that the traitors knew how betrayed they were. And one of the ways they did this was by burying people alive inside the castle walls. The practice of immuring someone inside a castle wall had been around since Roman times, but it became more popular during the Middle Ages. When someone was buried alive in a castle wall, they were usually left to die slowly of starvation and dehydration. Sometimes they were given food and water, but this was not always the case. Sometimes the person who was being buried alive would be able to escape, but this was rare. Most people who were buried alive in castle walls died within a few hours. There are many stories of people who have been buried alive in castle walls, but let's focus on one in particular. In 1548, a French soldier named François de Lannoy was captured by the Spanish and sentenced to death by burial. He was put in a coffin and buried in the sand, but after 3 hours he began to cry out for help. Eventually his pleas for help reached the governor of the city where he had been buried, and he was dug up and given a noble burial instead. However, this was not always the case. For example, during the siege of Carcassonne in 1209, the citizens who surrendered to Simon de Montfort were all killed except for 2 women who were buried alive in the castle walls. Another example is the story of Sir Ralph de Vipont, who was buried alive in the castle of Conisbrough in 1266 after he was found guilty of raping a woman. His body was exhumed 17 years later, and it is said that he was still alive when they dug him up. There is also the story of the Princess of Wales, who was buried alive in the Tower of London in 1429 after she was accused of plotting to kill the king. Her body was not recovered until 1673, more than 250 years later. These are just a few examples of the many people who were buried alive in castle walls during the Middle Ages. Now let's talk about another form of punishment that was similar to burial, but not quite the same thing. Have you ever heard of the expression walled in? If you have, you probably know that it means to trap someone or something in a corner or to prevent them from leaving a place. But did you know that the origin of this expression dates back to medieval times when a similar form of punishment was practiced? Back then, criminals who committed serious crimes such as murder, rape, and treason could be sentenced to death by being walled in. Instead of being buried alive, they were simply walled in. meaning that they were trapped inside a wall with no way to get out. Sometimes these people were left to die of starvation, while other times they were given food and water. But in either case, they were doomed to spend their final days trapped inside a dark, dank wall with nothing to do but wait for death to come. One of the most famous cases of someone being walled in happened in 1840, when a man named John Sloboda was sentenced to death for murdering his wife. He was locked up in a small room inside a wall and left to die. After he had been trapped inside for several weeks, his body began to decay and maggots started to appear. Eventually, the stench from the rotting body became so bad that it was clear that something was wrong. When the authorities finally opened up the wall to investigate, they found Sloboda's skeleton and the mummified remains of his cat, which he had brought with him into the wall. While this story may seem gruesome and disturbing, it is important to remember that it is just one of many similar cases that happened during medieval times. Being walled in was seen as a necessary punishment for those who committed heinous crimes, and the authorities believed that it was better for these criminals to die a slow and painful death than to be executed quickly. However, this form of punishment eventually fell out of favor as it became clear that it was not only cruel and unusual, but also ineffective in deterring crime. So now that we've talked about what immurement was and some of its origins, let's take a look at some of the reasons why someone might have been walled in. As we mentioned before, this form of punishment was usually reserved for those who committed serious crimes, such as murder, rape, and treason. However, there were also other reasons why someone might have been walled in. For example, during medieval times, people who were accused of witchcraft or heresy could also be sentenced to this form of punishment. It was believed that these people were dangerous and that they needed to be isolated from society to protect the safety of the people around them. Another reason why someone might have been walled in was if they were caught trying to escape from a castle or town. In some cases, people were walled in as a warning to others who might be thinking of doing the same thing. Finally, there were also instances when people were walled in simply because they were caught in the wrong place at the right time. For example, during times of war, soldiers who were captured by the enemy could be walled in even if they had not committed any crimes. As you can see, there were many different reasons why someone might have been sentenced to death by being walled in during medieval times. This form of punishment was often brutal and inhumane, but it was also a necessary evil in the eyes of the law. And speaking of the law, you might be wondering what the legal process was like for someone who was accused of a crime that carried the death penalty. Well, back in medieval times, the legal system was not nearly as advanced as it is today. There were no lawyers or judges, and trials were often more like public spectacles than they were court proceedings. If someone was accused of a crime, they were first brought before a group of local officials who would question them and try to get them to confess. If the accused person did confess, then they were usually found guilty and sentenced to death. Even if they did not confess, they were often still found guilty because the burden of proof was on the accused person to prove their innocence rather than on the accusers to prove their guilt. Once someone had been found guilty of a capital offense, they were usually sentenced to death by hanging or burning. However, in some cases they were sentenced to death by being walled in. As we mentioned earlier, this form of punishment was usually reserved for those who had committed the most heinous crimes. So if someone was accused of murder, rape, or treason, they might end up being walled in as a result. Overall, the legal process during medieval times was far from perfect, and there were many cases of innocent people being accused and punished for crimes they did not commit. Now that we've covered the history and legal process behind immurement, let's take a closer look at the actual practice itself. What did it really entail, and what was it like for the condemned person? Well, the first step of the process was, of course, to build the wall. This was usually done by a group of strong men who worked quickly to ensure that the condemned person would not be able to escape. Once the wall was in place, the prisoner was brought before it and prepared for their final moments. In some cases, they were given a chance to say their prayers or make a confession, while in other cases they were simply left to face their fate. After this, they were either pushed or dragged into the opening of the wall, and the opening was then sealed up with stones or bricks. The condemned person was then left to die inside the wall, and their body was left to decompose over time. It's important to note that there were variations of this practice depending on where it took place. For example, in some cases the condemned person was given food and water to prolong their life for as long as possible. Other times they were left to die of starvation and dehydration. Ultimately, the specific details of the punishment varied depending on the circumstances surrounding the crime and the sentence handed down by the authorities. So now that we understand the history, legal process, and practice of immurement, let's take a moment to reflect on why this form of punishment was used during medieval times. As we mentioned earlier, immurement was seen as a necessary evil by the authorities because it prevented the condemned person from escaping, and it also served as a warning to others who might be considering committing similar crimes. However, it's important to remember that immurement was not only a punishment for the condemned person, but also for their family and friends. The public nature of the punishment meant that everyone in the community was aware of what had happened, and it was a way of shaming the family of the condemned person. Overall, immurement was a brutal and inhumane form of punishment, but it was seen as necessary by the authorities during medieval times. While it may seem barbaric to us today, it was a way of ensuring that justice was served and that criminals were punished in a way that fit their crimes. If you enjoyed learning about this topic, we highly encourage you to check out our other videos on medieval history and other topics. With that said, thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in next time.